Opium Nation can be seen as a travel log. It's actually memoir and reportage. It's about my life as an exile going back and what it was like to go back and the experience of going back to Afghanistan. And I lived in the United States for 18 years before I went back the first time. And then I moved to Afghanistan and lived there. And my parents visited me. So it's two books in one, really. But the main story is not me. The main story are the people of Afghanistan who are somehow affected by the opium trade. And the opium trade is essentially the heroin trade, which is the most potent drug and the biggest drug business in the world. It provides 90% of the world's opiates. That includes Asia, Europe. 10 to 15% comes to the U.S. And these characters that I meet along the way, traveling across the country, are fascinating to me. They are child brides who are sold into who are bartered into marriage by their fathers who can't pay off their opium debt. The drug business is a high-risk business, and sometimes they give their daughters as payment. They are opium farmers who are women who are benefiting from the drug trade. They are corrupt officials who are taking cuts from traffickers to keep their jobs. And they also include good agents, good drug enforcement agents who've risked their lives to fight the trade. So it sort of looks at how it's impacted Afghans. And it's their stories. It's something that few others have really heard about. Most of the media really focuses on the farmers and the business aspect of it. But I think what I've done with Opium Nation is really bring the human toll to the fore. I'm a reporter, so I went looking for a story, and I found women's stories particularly interesting, partly because I had access to women. Foreign men who go inside Afghanistan do not have the same access that women do, partly because I speak the language in the north and the west. I speak Farsi or Dari, and I heard about a women's movement in this one town across the Iranian border. I went there and found out that the women's movement actually were these women victims whose town or whose district was deluged in the opium trade. Addicts lined the streets. Opium brides were too many. There were women prostitutes as a result of this trade. Many of these women had lost their husbands to the war on drugs. Basically, it didn't have anything to do with ideology or politics. And so that I sort of stumbled onto it. And as soon as I saw it, a few other people writing about it in the same way, and I took an intellectual interest. And then eventually one of these opium brides asked me for help. And then it became personal. The journey became very personal because I wanted to know how I can help her. She did not want to be married to this man who was 34 years older than her, who spoke a different language than her, who had another wife and 8 kids. And she was 12 years old. And so I went across the country trying to find out what this opium trade was about. And then eventually he took her. He was from Helmand, she was from Herat, 2 very different provinces. And then I went in search of her in Helmand. And sort of the book begins and ends with her. I think my favorite chapters are actually about my parents, because I got to see a different part of Afghanistan through their eyes, one that I hadn't experienced. And when they came back, my mom's experience was much more positive than my father's. My father fell into a deep depression after he came back to the U.S. He was expecting to see a better Afghanistan. He was expecting to feel at home, and he didn't. So the personal part was more difficult for me to write because I had to confront so many issues. But I think the moment in the book which most readers can say wow to, and I had a very hard time with it, it was a turning point, is when Darya, the girl I taught, the opium bride, asked me for help. She sat there as I was interviewing her husband, tugged on my coat and said, "Help me, I don't want to go." And I had never been asked in that way. As a journalist, you learn to keep a distance. You're not supposed to get involved with the story. And at that point, everything changed. And I had to reevaluate what this story was about. And this is one of the reasons it became a book, because it became such a long journey. It took me 5 years to research the book and 2 years to write it. So 7 years altogether. It was a lifetime, project, I would say. I think it's really important to have a nuanced perspective, and I think what I bring in other Afghan Americans or Afghan Germans or Afghans in the diaspora who go back bring that perspective. It's not necessarily better or worse. I think it's just different, and it is more nuanced in some ways than somebody who doesn't have that personal connection to the country and goes back and reports. I think you understand more, you're able to explain more. So I think we need all perspectives, actually. And things are skewed in the U.S. because you don't have that many Afghan American perspectives or Afghan perspectives at all. Part of the reason for that is, especially in the publishing industry, what they're looking for, the narrative they're looking for, they already have in their head. They don't want anything different. It was a struggle to sell this book because I wasn't the Muslim girl who needed to be saved. I was writing something very different. And the memoir part of this, I didn't really want to write. It was kind of imposed by the publishing industry in order to sell it. But at the same time, that said, I actually enjoyed writing it when I did begin, because it became a document of my family history. And so much of what my family, my grandfather was a writer, my father was a writer, has been destroyed in the war. So this is something that they can look at and say, we have something. Unfortunately, it hasn't been published in my home languages yet. It hasn't been published in Farsi, but it's been published in English and Italian so far. When I was living there from 2002 to 2007 and traveling throughout the country, there was a lot of hope. So that comes across the book. I think I'm trying to bring out the perspectives of the people. I think it might be a little different if I go there now. What I want and what is going to happen are two different things. The future prediction is gloomy. It's bleak. I think I had supported the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan initially. I think most Afghan Americans and most Afghans did, actually. But in the last 10 years, so many mistakes have been made. So much has gone wrong that the support for this war is done. And I think the combat mission will end in 2014. We need to focus on the development front. We need to focus on the reconstruction front. We cannot leave Afghanistan like we did before. That said, I think people are involved. If Americans are involved in making Afghanistan a better place for the people there, that means jobs, that means alternatives to the opium trade, that means schools, then perhaps it's not so gloomy. So I think the hope is really in what is going to happen in terms of infrastructure on the development front. And then politically, I think we really need to talk about the neighbors and what they're doing. Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, these countries have a lot of control inside Afghanistan, a lot more than they should. And whatever happens in the future, specifically Pakistan, needs to be dealt with. We need a strong leader, which we do not have in Afghanistan. But I always say you can't lose hope. Recently, one of the characters in the book, Neela, who was an art student, who was basically my confidant throughout this book, passed away. And she died from childbirth. I was able to come home and have 2 kids. And she and I married at the same time. And she got pregnant 5 years after and died. This is the reality of Afghanistan. And she was from a well-off family, from a liberal family, but that's just the way things are. And when I compare our lives, it becomes very difficult to reconcile things. I think people need to remember that these stories are not the end of these people's lives. These are snapshots. And these people live on. And they live on, some of them very happily. Some of the characters in the book have actually been killed, like General Dawood, Ahmad Wali Karzai's half-brother, who were allegedly involved in the drug trade I write about. Much has changed and much has stayed the same. The important thing I would like readers to know when they read this book is to stay engaged, to stay interested in Afghanistan. Nothing upsets me more than it's no longer in the news, we no longer care. That's sort of my parting message.